Conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Good morning, 3 minutes after 9 on Thursday the 13th of September. The LBC News headlines there reflecting the tension in number 10 that Mrs May has with her Brexit meeting. But there's considerable tension and greater tension elsewhere in the world, and something that sadly has reflected itself on too many occasions. I talk, of course, about the problems in the Middle East, although it's fair to say that just of late it does seem to be quieter than perhaps it has been at other times. And here to discuss those issues and to see where the peace process, or whatever it might be called, takes us next, our two representatives. First, Mark Regev, who's Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to the studio. We've met before. Good to have you back.
Good morning.
And Manuel Hassassian, you're the Palestinian Authority's diplomatic representative to the United Kingdom. I think we've spoken before, but this is the first opportunity I've met to meet you in the flesh, so welcome. Thank you for coming along.
Thank you.
And perhaps I could start with you, if that's all right, Mr. Hassassian. Many commentators are saying the so-called two-state solution is dead. Your interpretation of that?
I believe that the two-state solution is dead for the simple fact that after 25 years of signing the Oslo Agreement, what we have witnessed on the ground, dramatic changes in terms of building more settlements, land grabbing, building the wall and what have you. So, and with the stalemate in the peace process for the last, several years, we don't see, a light at the end of the tunnel anymore. And if Israel continues to build more settlements, and today we have like 261 settlements with more than 600,000 settlers, 42% of the West Bank is controlled by Israel. And things are not really improving on the ground with human rights violations and with the systematic policies of ethnic cleansing and with the new nation state law and what have you. I don't see any prospects of moving forward. I think we need a breakthrough. And that breakthrough is not coming from the United States, unfortunately. So that's why I always say we're stuck between the historically inevitable and the politically impossible. So things are not looking good.
And beyond any form of resuscitation, before I bring Mark Regev in?
I believe that it depends on Israel. If Israel wants peace, and this is my question to Mr. Regev, does Israel want peace? Does Israel want a two-state solution? Or does it want to continue with expanding and grabbing more land and making life miserable to the Palestinians? That's the question.
Mr. Ambassador, if you start with my question, I'm sure you'll respond to the other one. Your view of the two-state solution, is it, as use the expression again, dead?
I don't think we can give up on peace. I don't think anyone should give up on peace. I think historical reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians is ultimately in the interests of both sides. I'm not naive. I know it's not easy. I know that a lot of hard work has to be done. But I think it has to be in our minds, and has to be our goal. And if it's not possible today, it'll be possible tomorrow. And it's something that we can't give up on, because we owe it to ourselves and to our children to try to build a better Middle East, a more peaceful Middle East. Now, you say correctly, today is the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo agreements, and it's clear they have not been a great success. And if there was hope and illusion 25 years ago that somehow we were going to have a dramatic breakthrough, it's clear it didn't happen. And from the Israeli perspective, it's unfortunately all too clear why it didn't happen. I brought a copy in, a letter from the September 9th, 1993, a letter from then Chairman Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian National Movement, to our then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. And this letter, from the Israeli perspective, is the foundation of the peace process. In this letter, Chairman Arafat makes two core commitments to the Israeli side. One, that the Palestinian side totally rejects terrorism and abandons the use of terrorism. In other words, they will stop targeting innocent civilians. And two, he states here clearly that they commit themselves to resolving all outstanding issues through peaceful negotiations. Now, from the Israeli perspective, the Palestinians have clearly broken their promises. They did not keep these two core commitments, black on white, that Arafat made, and on the basis of this letter, Rabin signed the Oslo agreements.
Mr. Hassassian, your response to that?
Well, actually, yes, we are committed to the peace process. And yes, the PLO had dramatically changed its position from armed struggle to political accommodation.
Do you recognise what the ambassador said, that there's perhaps two parts, two covenants, if you will, of that letter?
Well, it takes two to tango. I mean, why the Palestinians would react the way they reacted if the Israelis were conceding to the fact that they have to redeploy and give the West Bank back to the Palestinians.
Yes, I mean, Mr. Hassassian, Mr. Ambassador, is saying the land grab has continued, of course.
Once again, the Oslo agreements were put in place, there was a series of commitments made by both sides, and Israel was asked, according to Oslo, to give land for peace. But the sad fact is, in the last 25 years, where Israel gave back land, we got the opposite of peace. And the most visible manifestation of that is Gaza, where Israel pulled out, took down all the settlements, redeployed behind the 1967 lines, and everyone said that's the secret for peace, just redeployed behind the 67 lines, and did we receive peace? Now, I don't say this to belittle Professor Hassasian. I don't say this because I want to give up on peace. I said before, I believe in peace, I believe in reconciliation. But we have to deal with the truth. Anyone who tells Israelis, all you have to do is pull out and everything will be hunky-dory, everything will be fine. The Gaza experience shows us that that's not true.
Professor, is that fair?
No, it's not fair. The reason why, because we were coordinating Palestinians and Israelis for the pullout, for the redeployment. What happened is Sharon unilaterally decided to move out from Gaza, and that pullout created chaos and put us in this situation.
All right, let's go to some of the calls. If you put the headphones on, we can take those calls. Professor and Mr. Ambassador, thank you. And first through is Sammy in Ealing. Sammy, you're on the radio. Go ahead, your question. And to whom are you addressing? Both people will have both the representatives have the opportunity to come, but who's it addressed to first? Sammy, good morning.
Well, hi, good morning to you, Nick, and to your guests. Well, my question goes to the Palestinian representative, Mr. Hassasian. Now, how effective is the Palestinian leader when it comes to representing all Palestinians? Because Palestinians are frustrated and outraged from his weak position not defending the Palestinian rights. And also my question to Mr. Rajab.
You're referring to Mahmoud Abbas, aren't you, when you say this? Just to get this right.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so part one is how effective a leader is Abbas. So that's for the Professor. And the Ambassador, your question, Sammy?
And also my question to Mr. Rajab. If you keep weakening the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian leadership, who's the alternative? Who are you going to deal with?
All right. Stay on the line. You will have a chance to respond. Professor, the first question.
Yes.
Is he still an effective leader?
He is an effective leader, and he is the only leader that could deliver the peace process. And he is not weak, as Mr. Sammy has just mentioned, for the simple fact that he defied Israeli systematic policies. He defied the Americans' position when it came to the recognition of Jerusalem, as the capital of Israel and moving the embassy. I don't think he is a weak president. He is a pragmatic president, choosing between constraints. He has been adamantly trying, to as much as he can, to go back to the peace process. He is,
If you, and I know you have close links with the United States, if you buy that United States is possibly very key to this, the relationship he has with Trump is not a healthy one, is it, Professor?
No, because, President Trump has imposed solutions to the intractable issues of Jerusalem and the right of return, which is, the refugees and the position that the U.S. is taking against UNRWA. That in itself is preempting the entire peace process and put us back, to square one.
Sammy's question to you, Mr. Ambassador, is if you have issues, as we know you do, are you possibly going to get something worse in its place, better to deal with the folks you know?
Well, we certainly hope not, and we don't rule out Mr. Abbas. Our position is clear. We're willing to restart the negotiations with him, with his government, anytime, anywhere. If the Palestinian Authority has got challenges, they're internal challenges, but we don't rule him out as a partner. We've been very critical of some of his policies. We've been very critical of some of his actions, which we see as counterproductive to peace, but we don't rule him out at all.
Marco's in Willesden Green. Marco, your question, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, my question is this. What compromises would each of you be willing to make to gain a lasting peace? And that's a question for each of you.
All right, let's start with the Ambassador on this occasion. Mr. Ambassador, what compromises will we hear from your side?
We know, as former Israeli Prime Minister said, Ariel Sharon said, he knows that peace will require painful compromises. His words, not mine. For real peace, we are willing to go quite a way.
What does that mean?
It's clear that on issues that are crucial for Israel, we will have to compromise on parts of our homeland that we think are very, very dear to us. Ultimately, people have talked to us about territory for peace, and we're talking about territories that are very, very dear to the Jewish people. But for
it's
real
not off
peace,
the table.
For real peace, we're willing to make concessions, but it has to be real peace. Once again, I spoke a moment ago about the experience in Gaza, where Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip. And we didn't get peace, we got the opposite. We got thousands of rockets on our citizens. It has to be real peace.
Professor?
We made our painful historic concession when we signed the Oslo Agreement. We gave up already 78% of historic Palestine, and we are now negotiating on 22% of the West Bank, which Israel is still calling Judea and Samaria. So what concessions can the Palestinians give more than what we have given? Israel believes in concessions as if, it owns Palestine, and now they are conceding certain territory to the Palestinians. That in itself, is a rejected rhetoric because, we have paid our dues and we had made our painful concession by accepting the state of Israel over 78% of historic Palestine.
Let me move to other matters. A question for you. I'll come to both of you, but again, I'll start with you, if I may, Mr. Ambassador. How helpful was it for President Trump to move the location of the embassy?
Very helpful. It was a good decision. He corrected a historic injustice. There is a norm...
Not inflammatory in any way, Mr.
Not
Ambassador?
at all. There's a norm on this planet that every country gets to choose its own capital city and that other people recognize that and honor that. You've even had examples, and you know this, Nick, where countries have actually moved their capitals. The Germans moved their capital from Bonn to Berlin. The Chinese moved their capital. The Brazilians moved their capital. And when countries move their capital cities, other people recognize that. Now, Jerusalem has always been the capital city of the Jewish people, and it's always been the capital of the modern state of Israel since 1949. Recognizing that is simply to recognize reality and to recognize what is just.
Professor, was it inflammatory?
Jerusalem is an occupied city. And President Trump does not have the right, to accept this fact and to recognize the Jerusalem as the capital of Israel for the simple fact that he defied all international law, all United Nations laws concerning East Jerusalem, concerning Jerusalem per se. And I think this is an act of defiance. Now, if Israel wants to claim that Jerusalem is capital, we have nothing to do with it. But there is no international recognition. Show me how many countries have recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Well, I can't say. Mr. Ambassador, do you want to respond to that?
It's true. The Americans have started. I believe others will follow. I hope eventually this country, the United Kingdom, will follow too. It's only just.
Are you sensing that it will?
No.
I can't tell you there's an indication yet.
No.
I can accept what Professor Khassasian has just said, but I never give up hope. And ultimately, what are the facts? The facts are Jerusalem is where the Israeli parliament is, the Israeli Supreme Court is, it's where our executive branch steps. When British leaders meet Israeli leaders, they do so in Jerusalem. Recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital is simply to recognize reality. And I would say one more point, if you'll allow me.
Yes, of course.
There won't be peace without recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And this is a fundamental element in any sort of peace process.
All right. I must allow you, because you were shaking your head rather animated.
First of all, the British government had made it very clear and explicit that they will never recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And as a matter of fact, as it is the capital for Israel, it should be the capital for Palestine. And this is the whole concept of a two-state solution.
All right, let's come to other calls. Thank you, Professor. Ian in Brighton, your question. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, morning, gentlemen. How do they feel about a decision by the President to stop the aid to the Palestinians?
This was within the last 2 or 3 weeks, the Trump administration announcing decisions to cut $200 million from the US aid budget to the Palestinians. Actually, Professor will stay with this. Was despite the funds being approved by Congress earlier in the year. Professor.
They cannot blackmail us and they cannot buy us with money. We have political stands. We believe, we have deep conviction that this is not the way to move forward, and the Americans have taken the wrong side of history by supporting Israel on issues that consider to be very pertinent to the outcome of the future prospects for the peace process. So, cutting aid and such things cannot twist our arms, and I think we will have alternatives to such aids from different countries.
What will the impact be of the loss of funds?
Well, the impact will be detrimental, but we can survive. We have survived 100 years of this protracted conflict. I don't think $200 million is going to make us succumb, to the diktat of U.S. policies in the Middle East and in particular Palestine.
And before we throw it over to the Ambassador, Professor, staying with you, this was reportedly because the Palestinian side had not taken steps to advance the start of direct and meaningful negotiations with Israel. Was that fair?
We are ready to start negotiations if Israel stops building settlements and if Israel stops, taking drastic measures against our people in Jerusalem and in the West Bank.
Right. But that's cost hundreds of millions of dollars.
That's fine.
That's fine. Mr. Ambassador.
Professor Hassian said that the Palestinian side will look for alternatives to the American funding. And I would like to suggest one, if I might be so bold. Every year the Palestinians spend about £300 million in giving money to murderers, in giving money to terrorists who've killed innocent civilians. This is close to 10% of the Palestinians' budget. Even the British public needs to know there was a young British woman, Hannah Bladen, who was brutally murdered. She was a student and she was murdered by a Palestinian terrorist. According to Palestinian law and the way your system works at the moment, her murderer receives money for the whole length of his prison term in an Israeli jail. Now, it's interesting because according to the Palestinian rules, if I'm a car thief and I'm in an Israeli jail, I get no money from the Palestinian Authority. If I'm a rapist and I'm in an Israeli jail, I get no money from the Palestinian Authority. But if I've killed someone, if I'm a murderer, a terrorist, then the Palestinian government will fund me. So here's £300 million that I suggest you could better use in your hospitals and in your schools.
Professor, do you recognise that figure?
First of all, I don't have the figure exactly, but I will argue the concept, the principle.
Yes, okay, the principle or the idea. The ambassador is right. Payments are made.
Payments are made to families whose husbands, sons, whatever, are in prison for political reasons. And this is
including
a department,
murder.
not murder. And this is not the way we have to pursue
what
this
is
issue.
a political reason then?
Political reasons is sometimes, you are under house arrest, you are under administrative detention with no due process of law, and these people are, supporting families, and they have people to support and to feed. So the Palestinian Authority helps symbolically.
So who receives
these
the money?
families.
The man or the imprisoned man or the wife?
No, the family.
Their money goes there.
Yeah, to the family of those imprisoned.
And I'm offering no opinion here, but that could be what we would call a terrorist.
No.
No.
I reject that. No.
Right.
It's not terror. We had 110,000 prisoners inside Israeli jails. Are all those terrorists?
Well, let's put some of this back, Mr. Ambassador. Do you want to reassess your facts?
No, I'm very sure of my facts, and these are issues that we've raised internationally, and I don't think anyone contends the facts. We might have different terminology. But if tomorrow a poor Palestinian, let's say someone from a deprived neighborhood, picks up a knife and kills innocent people, and he goes to jail, he and his family receive, for the extension of his prison service, money from the Palestinian Authority. Now, for a poorer family, this can be a lot of money. As I say, it's close to 10% of the Palestinian budget. It's about £300 million every year. Now, that's more than the money that we've heard the Americans are cutting. This is an incentive for people to make violence, to kill innocent people. Once again, Palestinians in Israeli jails who've done other criminal acts get no money. Right. It's only if you kill Israelis, or kill, in this case, the case I mentioned, a British subject, in the framework of what they call their armed struggle.
We must move on, but of course the professor is saying it goes to the family. It goes to, for the purpose of debate, it goes to the wife and the children, not the man.
No, part of the money, if I'm not mistaken, you'll correct me, goes to the prisoners themselves as some sort of stipend that they receive in jail, that the Palestinian gives them this money, and with that they can buy things in the canteen and so forth.
Yes, that is true.
That was my point.
But that is true, because you don't offer them food and stuff
that's
like that.
That's not true. I don't accept that.
So why do they need the canteen money?
That's for extras. That's the Red Cross strictly abides by all these. We make sure
Let me just respond
very
briefly.
Point on this,
yes,
Professor.
final point.
Thank you, because we have other calls.
I received a letter several years ago from the British government concerning, the issues that Mr. Regev had raised here.
Yes.
And after thorough investigation by DFID and other agencies, they have proved they stopped funding us, and they have proved that the money is not going to prisoners, and they started refunding us, and there is no problem with that. So it was resolved.
All right. Let's leave that there. You've both made very cogent arguments, and I'm grateful to you for observing some diplomacy there. Daniel's in Barnet. Daniel, you're on the radio. Your question.
Hi, Nick. Hi, Mark. Hi, Professor Hassanian. Thank you very much for having me on board.
Yes, sir.
Just kind of continuing on the point that was just now made, what effect do you think this has on anti-Semitism in Europe and the UK? just to have a policy to pay the families of terrorists.
Okay, let's talk more. I'm not cutting that out, but I think we've sort of gone as far as we can with that. But and I think I'll come to the ambassador first. The sense of anti-Semitism, and of course hard right. We're seeing the hard right in much of Europe, and certainly issues of that here in the UK, Mr. Ambassador.
It is a concern. I think it's a concern not just for Jewish people, but for all people of goodwill. You have seen in Europe, 7 decades since the Second World War, since the terrible years of the Holocaust, you've seen the re-emergence of anti-Semitism, whether on the extreme right in parts of Europe, whether it's the extreme left in other parts of Europe. It is a matter of concern, and it's something that we have to speak out against.
The Labour Party here in the United Kingdom's been had of enormous issues as regarding anti-Semitism, and in some ways one of its former key movers, Chuka Umunna, admits that it's in all sorts of dire problems. How do you see the Labour Party in Britain?
Look, it's not really important how I see it, but I've seen polling of the British public, and about half believe that there's an anti-Semitism problem there, and more importantly, the leadership itself recognises this as a problem and has committed itself publicly to deal with it.
Professor, do you think the UK is becoming more anti-Semitic?
Well, let me just define our position.
Sure.
We are against anti-Semitism because we are Semites too. Palestinians and Israelis are Semites.
Yeah.
And we don't like to see racism, dealing with Israel on that perspective. We criticize Israeli policies in the occupied territories, and this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And that's why, I'm not supporter of anti-Semitism, because that is a racist ideology. And we are very clear on this position.
The Labour Party got itself all sorts of problems because of the International Holocaust definition. Are you happy with that definition, Professor?
Which
the International Holocaust definition of what comprises, or what constitutes, anti-Semitism, and that was the key turning point. It's the ability to criticise, very, very brutally subbed down, and apologies, Mr. Ambassador, but it's the ability to criticise the foundation of Israel that was the sticking point, if you will.
We believe that the Holocaust happened and the Jewish people have paid a heavy price in history. We condemn that, and this is our position.
And coming back to you, Mr. Ambassador, it did turn a lot on it, didn't it? The ability to criticise the foundation of the State of Israel.
Look, no one has to agree with the policies of the Israeli government. And as Professor Hassasian just said, he's critical of those policies. But there's a difference between that and anti-Semitism. If you single out Israel as the source of evil on the planet, the Jewish state is the source of evil, as some do. If you say the Jewish people have no right to national self-determination, everyone else does, but not the Jews. In other words, if you hold the Jews to a standard you hold no one else to, if you see the Jews or the Jewish state as more evil than anyone else, this is a question like I raised with the boycott movement. If someone has never boycotted any of the Middle East's many autocracies, but calls for a boycott of the Middle East's only democracy, in other words, if someone says, I've never boycotted Assad's Syria, or never boycotted the Ayatollah's Iran, or Gaddafi's Libya, yes, but I boycott the only democracy in the Middle East, which happens to be a Jewish state, one has to ask, what is that all about?
And do you sense Britain is becoming more anti-Semitic, Mr. Ambassador, before we move on to other matters?
I don't think my opinion here is important, but it's clear the Jewish community increasingly has concerns.
But the Israeli president says that it's in full sight in Europe, didn't he?
Yes, and my Prime Minister did put out a statement criticising Mr. Corbyn on an issue which is very sensitive to Israelis, because he was apparently at a ceremony where the murderers of the Munich athletes were the Israeli team, and not only were they bound and then murdered, but their bodies were mutilated. It was a terrible atrocity, and it has a very serious raw nerve in Israel. And I would say to Professor Hassasian, on this issue too, we have a problem with you and your government, because you too honour the murderers of Munich. The whole international community at the last Olympic Games united in remembering the Israeli athletes, and yet you choose to remember the murderers and to call them heroes. Why is that?
We choose to call them murderers.
These were the people who were involved in the kidnapping and subsequent execution of the
That was in 1972.
But why today still hold them up on a pedestal? Why do you call them heroes, the murderers?
Mr. Corbyn attracted a lot of criticism because he was filmed attending that ceremony.
Yes, I am aware of that, yes, and I had press releases, and I stood by him. He went to put wreath on the martyrs of Israeli air raid on Tunisians and Palestinians in Tunis.
But he was
and this is what he did.
Yes.
Now, it happened that, the tomb of Abu Iyad was there, and he is the leader who was not behind the Munich thing. He was the leader who changed the strategy of the PLO from armed struggle to political accommodation.
Ambassador Regev's central point is, why would you choose to honour these people?
When did we honour them? I mean, are we honouring them every day?
You have streets and squares in the West Bank named after the murderers of Munich.
I'm not aware of that.
You're not aware of that. Then let's move on to other matters. Let's come to some of the questions we're getting via the text, tweets and emails. Kenneth in Dartford. To be a two-state solution, Israel would surely have to accept that Palestine is a state. How likely is that? I will come to you, Professor, but would come to you obviously first, Mr. Ambassador. You would have to accept that Palestine is a state.
We accept that the Palestinian people have legitimate national aspirations. I think my Prime Minister at the time of the Camp David agreements in the 1970s already accepted the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. We have spoken about living in peace with the Palestinians, but I would urge your listeners to understand the Israeli perspective here. When someone says Palestinian state, if a Palestinian state looks like Syria, or looks like Iraq, or looks like Iran, is that a solution? Does the Middle East need another dysfunctional, failed state?
How do you know it would be dysfunctional?
Well, once again, we'd like to hire a certain amount of guarantees that it'll be a successful state and not look like Gaza, because that's not good for Israel, that's not good for Palestinians, that's not good for anyone who wants to see peace in the Middle East.
The likelihood that your people will be able to have a state, Professor?
Let me just remind Mr. Regev that we have built infrastructures under Israeli occupation, and we have a national economy, but the restrictions that the Israelis put on the Palestinians make that impossible. Now, the question of Gaza is an internal matter. It is a priority for the Palestinian leadership.
So what do you mean by an internal? You don't want to discuss it?
No. I'm trying to say that the internal problems between Fatah and Hamas is a step towards, the building of a state.
Yes.
Once we do that, I mean, we don't have any problems in having, a strong state with the help of the international community, let alone if Israel cooperates. We won't have a failed state, because Mr. Regev knows very well that the Palestinians and what we have today in the occupied territories is the most democratic in the Middle East.
All right. Well, I come to the final question. I'm going to stay with you, Professor, if I may. Is the situation, we've talked about Gaza, is it really sustainable? And what would be the formula for ending what we see there now?
It is a disaster in Gaza, and I think this is a recipe for more violence. And I don't think the question of Gaza will be resolved if Israel continues with its embargo and with closing all the entrances to Gaza. And I think, if Israel wants really to have a situation where there won't be any more clashes in the future, they have to ease the tensions on Gaza, give the Palestinians the right of mobility and what have you, and that's the way we can resolve the issue of violence in Gaza.
How sustainable is the Gaza situation, for want of a better word, Mr. Ambassador?
It's not looking good, and we're willing as Israel to play a part together with the international community to help rectify where there are problems. I'd urge Professor Khassasian and his government to lift their sanctions on the Gaza Strip, which, by preventing the money flowing, you are contributing, I believe, to a more difficult situation, which is an impetus for violence. I'd urge the Palestinian Authority to lift all its sanctions on Gaza, the funds that are not going through. I think that could be a very important move.
And our questions are over, my questions are over. Lastly, if you had one question that you would ask of each other for a response, briefly if you would, because we're already up to time. So again, let's start with you, Mr. Ambassador. What question would you ask of the Professor?
I'd say to the Professor, we get on personally as people.
I can see that, yeah.
And it's only a pity that the larger political situation cannot reflect that. I believe in peace. I believe in reconciliation. And I'd ask the Professor, can he accept that the Jewish people have a historic connection to the land of Israel? Does he accept that the Jewish people have a right to national self-determination in their country? Not saying at the expense of your people, because I believe this is the reason we haven't had peace so far. Ultimately, in 1947, the UN put a partition proposal on the table, which was accepted by our side and rejected by his side. So if I had to ask a simple question, will he say today, in front of this important British audience, will he say that the Palestinians made a mistake in 1947 rejecting the partition plan that could have made peace possible?
Your response and your question.
Actually, I don't want to answer that question.
Okay.
I leave that to history. But I deal with the current situation on the ground.
Okay.
We have recognized the state of Israel in the Oslo Agreement.
Okay.
And we have recognized the legitimate right of the Israelis.
Okay.
But I ask Mr. Regeb.
Yes, your question.
Yeah, my question. Does he recognize or his state the nationhood of the Palestinians? And does he recognize that there should be a state of Palestine? And where are the borders of Israel?
All right, we leave those questions hanging there. Gentlemen, absolute pleasure to meet you for the first time.
Thank
See
you.
you again, Mr. Ambassador Mark Regeb, Israeli Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and good to meet you, Professor Manuel Hassassian. You're the Palestinian Authority's diplomatic representative in the United Kingdom. Thank you for coming by the studios. News on LBC is next.
The Israeli ambassador to the UK has told LBC he hopes Britain follows America's lead in moving its embassy to Jerusalem. Mark Regev has taken part in an historic debate with his Palestinian counterpart, Manuel Hassassian, who says President Trump defied all international law by moving the embassy. The Russian state-funded news channel RT said